The alarm began as a whisper and escalated into a scream in less than 3 seconds. First-class analyst Vera Osketh was in the middle of her 18-hour shift when the long-range sensors of the flagship, the Matriarch's Fist, cascaded into light, painting the operations center a red she had never seen during the 8 cycles of her career in the Cathar Empire's intelligence services. Red meant a classified anomaly. Pulsating red, in all quadrants simultaneously, meant something for which the operational manuals simply had no name. Vera was a middle-aged Cathar, which, in terms of galactic longevity, placed her among the most experienced beings to have ever traversed the outer arm of the galaxy. Her species had evolved on a triple-gravity planet, and this translated into dense musculature beneath blue-gray skin, eyes adapted to wavelengths ranging from deep infrared to ultraviolet, and a bone structure that made every movement deliberate, heavy, and precise. Cathar did not run. They did not need to. They had conquered 16 star systems in the last 4 centuries by the simple combination of patience, strength, and a collective will that functioned as a single mind when focused on a goal. But none of these qualities had been tested before crossing the border marked by the warning buoys of silent space. The decision had been Fleet Commander Hazreth ul-Quran's, and Vera had registered her formal objection 3 times before the crossing, all 3 times rejected with the same bureaucratic coldness that characterized Hazreth's leadership. The commander was a political survivor, not a strategist. She had risen to the highest rank in the reconnaissance fleet, not through tactical brilliance, but through an uncanny ability to never be present when results were bad and always in the spotlight when they were good. Vera had served under better and worse commanders, but she had never felt so vividly the difference between competence and rank as she did at that moment, when the emergency lights painted Hazreth's angular face red, and the only expression she saw there was stubbornness. The fleet consisted of 9 ships, 6 Fist-class destroyers, 2 supply freighters converted into analysis platforms, and the flagship, a heavy reconnaissance cruiser nearly 2 kilometers long, the pride of the Cathar Imperial Fleet's 5th Squadron. Vera had reviewed the files on the territory they were about to cross during the weeks of travel leading up to the mission. What she found kept her awake for several rotations. Humans had emerged as a recognized galactic entity just over 3 centuries ago, long enough for most sentient species to have already formed an opinion about them. The problem was that opinions diverged so radically that Vera had spent weeks trying to find a pattern, and the only pattern that emerged was this. Every species that had entered into hostile contact with humans never repeated the mistake. Those that survived to tell the tale, at least. Cathar intelligence files on humanity were cataloged under the designation Fog Class, which technically meant information too incomplete to be considered operationally reliable. There were reports of fleets that entered silent space and returned with their ships intact and crews in a state of severe psychological collapse. There were reports of fleets that simply did not return. What was not present in any file of any intelligence agency of any of the 23 civilizations that comprised the Galactic Coalition was a satisfactory explanation for how a species with only 3 centuries of space travel had become the most effective guardian of its own territory in all of recorded galactic history. The alarm continued to pulse. What the sensors showed made no immediate sense, and so Vera needed 2 full verification cycles before accepting the data as real. The fleet had just crossed what the maps designated as Line 37, an astronomical landmark deep within silent space where stellar density dropped abruptly, creating a kind of dark chamber between 2 spiral arms. It was a natural phenomenon, catalogued and of no obvious strategic importance, except that the long-range sensors of the Matriarch's Fist had detected simultaneously, from all scanning angles at once, the exact same thing. Nothing. Not an absence of signal. Active silence, as if the space ahead was not merely empty, but deliberately quiet, like the held breath of something that did not want to be heard before its time. Vera went to the advanced analysis station, entered her priority code, and began running scans on frequencies that standard protocols did not include, the so-called ghost bands, electromagnetic spectra where unconventional transmissions could hide. She found 3 anomalies in less than 2 minutes. The first was a frequency modulation so subtle it seemed like cosmic background noise, but it had a pattern. The second was an irregular gravitational field that did not correspond to any detectable mass object. The third was the most disturbing, a slight space-time distortion, stable and continuous, that only appeared when observing a specific cone of space at the fleet's bow. Someone was watching them. Vera prepared the report, encrypted it with maximum urgency protocol, and went to Commander Hazreth personally because a digital message could be ignored, and she knew, with the certainty of 8 cycles of intelligence service, that what she had detected could not wait. Hazreth listened to the report in silence, seated in the command chair with her claws crossed over the console in front of her, a posture Vera recognized as Kethar body language for forced deliberation, for the performance of thinking when the decision had already been made. The answer, when it came, was exactly what Vera had feared. Advance. Maximum sustained speed. Humans would understand that the Kethar Imperial Fleet did not retreat in the face of sensory anomalies. Vera registered her 4th formal objection and returned to her station, where she spent the next hours doing what intelligence analysts do when they cannot change the course of events: document everything with enough precision so that, later, someone could understand exactly what had happened and why. It would not be the first time an intelligence analyst was the only coherent witness to a disaster, but she hoped, with the irrational part of herself that still believed the universe had some sense of fairness, that this time it would not be necessary. The response from the space ahead arrived at the beginning of the next shift, not as a communication, not as a warning, but as a silence even deeper than the previous one. A silence that had texture, that had weight, that made the ship's sensors stop registering background noise, as if the universe itself had paused to see what would happen next. Vera looked at the blank panels, then at Commander Hazreth, then back at the panels. In 22 cycles of her career, she had learned to distinguish the silence that preceded a storm from the silence that preceded something for which the Kethar language had no word. This was the second kind. The nebula ahead of the fleet was not on any map, not because no one had charted it, but because all scan files for the sector were composed entirely of metadata without content, as if the space they were supposed to represent had refused to be documented. Analyst Vera Osketh had spent the last 18 hours trying to reconstruct the region's geometry using PULSAR triangulation, and the result had left her in silence for 20 full minutes, which, for a Kethar, was the equivalent of a breakdown. The nebula had form, not the chaotic organic shape of natural phenomena, the irregular expansion of ionized gases following the impulse of dead stars. This one had perfect bilateral symmetry, like a lung made of light, and pulsed with a frequency that the ship's sensors identified as 96 galactic standard beats per minute. Vera had checked the calculation 4 times. There was no doubt the nebula was breathing at the rate of a human heart at rest. Commander Hazreth had dismissed the data as instrumental pareidolia, the technical term for when sensors interpret patterns in random noise, but the matriarch's fist's sensors were calibrated for a margin of error of 0.003%, and Vera had been unable to find a statistical explanation that would reduce the pattern to noise. The nebula was breathing because something was making it breathe, and that meant there was something inside it large enough to alter the pressure dynamics of gases in a structure 12 astronomical units in diameter. They were navigating towards the interior of a living being, or towards the interior of something that wanted them to believe it was a living being. Vera was unsure which of the 2 hypotheses was more disturbing. The graveyard emerged from the mist slowly, like a bad memory resisting recall. First appeared the silhouettes, dark against the diffuse luminescence of the gases. Shapes Vera recognized as ships before she could identify any structural detail, because there was something in the geometry of a spacecraft built by intelligence that made it immediately recognizable, regardless of the species that had built it. Then, as the fleet slowed and short-range sensors began to fill in the details, the scale of what they were seeing became clear. There were hundreds, perhaps more, ships of dozens of different morphologies, representing species Vera recognized from the archives and species she had never seen documented, floating in an arrangement that was neither chaotic nor completely organized, as if they had arrived at different times and simply stopped where they were, without impulse, without rotation, absolutely motionless in a vacuum that should have made them drift by inertia. Commander Hazreth ordered an exploration team to approach the nearest wreckage. Vera volunteered to lead the group, not out of courage, but because she needed primary data that no remote sensor could provide. The ship they selected belonged to a species the archives identified as Vrethkai, an arboreal-type civilization from the Inner Arm that had tried to expand its territory into silent space about 90 years ago, sending a fleet of 17 reconnaissance ships and never receiving any transmissions back. The Vrethkai, as a species, had assumed the fleet had been destroyed in a navigation anomaly and closed the matter. What they found upon docking the emergency hatch and crossing into the interior of the dead ship revealed that reality had been considerably more complicated. The crew was there. All of them at their stations, in their rest nets, in the corridors, exactly where they had been when time, for them, had stopped. There were no signs of decomposition, no structural damage, no marks of combat on any surface. The ship was in perfect operational order, except for the fact that all systems were shut down and no one on board was alive in the way the word normally implies. They were preserved in a translucent substance, similar in appearance to quartz crystal, that had permeated every surface of the ship in a layer a few millimeters thick. There was nothing organic in this substance. It was, in the best analysis Vera's portable equipment could offer, a form of space-temperature stable polymer that had formed around every object, every crew member, every screw, and every exposed wire, in a process that should have taken months if it followed any known chemistry. What the most elementary analysis revealed, however, was what made Vera remain motionless for a long moment before she could formulate the next observation. The substance was engineered. It was not a natural byproduct of any physical or chemical process she knew. It was a technology, and a technology sufficiently advanced that the difference between it and a natural phenomenon was indistinguishable without deep analysis. Someone had done this with deliberation and absolute precision, preserving every component of the ship and every member of its crew as if preparing an exhibition. In the data terminals, which strangely still responded to external reading interfaces, Vera found the ship's final logs. The crew had had enough time to record what was happening. 11 minutes. That had been the interval between the first contact with the force that had stopped them and the moment the logs ended. 11 minutes to neutralize a fleet of 17 ships. Without a single explosion, without a single projectile, without loss of pressure, without structural failure, without anything resembling combat as any galactic species defined it. The final log entry was from a Vrethkai navigation officer who had used her last conscious moments to write a single sentence. "They are holding us in their hands and we can barely see them." Vera took the data back to the flagship and presented the full report to Commander Hazreth without omitting any detail. It was the fourth time she had presented information that should, rationally, alter the course of the mission. It was the fourth time she hoped the weight of evidence would be enough to compensate for the weight of pride. Hazreth listened until the end, which was progress compared to previous interactions. Then she remained silent for a time that, by Kethar standards, amounted to genuine deliberation. When she spoke, Her voice had the specific tone Vera had learned to recognize as the voice the commander used when she had made a decision and was formulating the narrative that would justify that decision to herself and to others. Humans, Hazreth said, had demonstrated an interesting defensive capability. But the Kethar fleet was not like the ships lying in that improvised graveyard. The Empire had spent the last 2 centuries developing technologies specifically for undocumented high-risk environments. The Matriarch's fist had gravitational field shields that could neutralize any known containment technology. And more importantly, the humans had not destroyed any of those fleets. They had only immobilized them, which meant they did not want to start a war, which meant they could be negotiated with. Vera wanted to say that the distinction between they didn't want to destroy and they couldn't destroy was the difference between safety and suicide. She wanted to say that 11 minutes was not enough time for any defensive technology to respond. She wanted to say that the only thing the evidence proved with certainty was that humans had the power to do whatever they wanted with everything that entered their space, and that the absence of destruction so far was their choice, not a limitation. Instead, she registered her 5th formal objection, returned to her analysis station, and began preparing contingency plans that probably no one would ever read. Outside, the nebula continued breathing at its steady rate of 96 beats per minute, patient like something that knows time does not run the same way for everything in the universe. The human ship did not appear. It was there, and then the space around it simply stopped hiding it. This was the most accurate way Vera Osketh had found to describe the event in the records she kept parallel to the official ship's log, because the sensors had detected no approach, registered no speed transition, picked up no signal of propulsion or mass displacement. A ship approximately 200 meters long was 400 units away from the flagship Matriarch's Fist, and the only reason any Kethar instrument had noted its presence was that it had activated its own identification transmission field, like a living being that decides, at a certain moment, to make enough noise to be perceived. The human ship was small by the standard of any galactic war fleet. It was elegant in a way that Kethar usually did not value in military engineering, without the angular geometries that signaled offensive capability, and without the excessive volumes that communicated power through brute scale. It had lines that seemed more hydrological than mechanical, curves that suggested something designed to move with space instead of against it. Vera noted that the hull had been constructed in layers of materials that spectrometers identified but could not classify within any existing engineering database. The communication channel opened before Commander Hazreth could formulate an order. It was not an invasion of the ship's systems, not a frequency hijack. It was simply that the Matriarch's Fist's universal translator, a system that had been designed to decode languages of 43 cataloged species, began functioning on a channel it had identified and prioritized itself, as if recognizing that what it was receiving deserved immediate attention. Kethar vessel classified as Matriarch's Fist, reconnaissance fleet of the 5th Squadron, departed the Korhas system 42 days ago. We have identified Fleet Commander Hazreth ul Quran and 8 senior crew members. We are aware of your Chief Engineer's health status and recommend he consult his medical records from the last cycle. We are not hostile. We are talking to you. We ask you to respond in kind. The silence on the command bridge had a different quality after the transmission. It was the silence of beings who had heard something that reorganized in real time their mental model of the situation they were in. Vera observed the officers around her and saw on their faces the specific expression Kethar display when the world presents information that does not fit into any existing category of experience. Because what the human voice had said, in a frequency modulation perfectly calibrated for the comfortable Kethar auditory range, in a translation that had lost no nuance of the formal imperial language, was impossible. Humans had identified every senior crew member by name. They had provided information about Chief Engineer Varek that was not in any database external to the ship. They had described the travel route with enough precision for reconstitution to be verifiable. This meant they had observed the fleet throughout its 42-day journey. It meant they had access to internal information that Cathar security protocols theoretically made impenetrable. It meant that the feeling that the fleet had been under observation since before crossing the first warning buoy was not analytical paranoia. It was the belated recognition of a surveillance that had been as discreet as it was complete. Commander Hazreth responded. Vera had expected pride to prevail, and silence to be the chosen response. But something in the human transmission had altered the commander's calculation, perhaps the detail about the chief engineer, which was genuinely private information, or perhaps simply the tone of voice, which had not been the voice of a species demonstrating superiority, but the voice of someone who had decided to begin a difficult conversation in the most direct way possible. Hazreth identified the fleet, declared they were on a civilian reconnaissance mission, and asked by what authority humans blocked the passage of Cathar Empire ships through unclaimed interstellar space. The human response arrived in 6 seconds, enough time for a mind to process the question and formulate a considered answer. Not enough time to consult any database or await instruction from a superior. This space is unclaimed because we prefer not to have neighbors who need warnings about borders. The buoys transmit in 12,000 languages because we believe every species capable of building an interstellar ship deserves to receive information in the language they best understand. We are not blocking passage, Commander Ul-Quran. We are initiating the conversation the buoys mention. The conversation every ship entering this space without prior contact receives. You have 2 options. We can help you return to the border safely, or we can talk about what brought you here. We are honestly curious about you. Curious. Vera read the transmission 3 times on her station's auxiliary screen before beginning to analyze it in depth. There was something in the structure of human language, even in translation, that was different from any alien language she had studied. It was direct without being threatening. It was informative without being preachy. It was, above all, the language of an entity that did not need to prove anything about itself because it had already proven everything that mattered simply by being there, small and quiet, 400 units away from a 9-ship war fleet. The humans' curiosity about the Cathar fleet did not seem strategic. It seemed genuine. And this was the observation Vera needed to examine carefully. Because her entire career had been built on the premise that every galactic species interacted with others from an agenda, and that the task of intelligence was to identify that agenda before it became a threat. The idea that humans could simply be curious was so outside the reference framework of any Cathar analyst that it took a deliberate moment to accept it as a real possibility. What happened next was something Vera would classify, in the reports she wrote years later, as the moment the mission definitively turned from a reconnaissance exercise into something for which there was no adequate name in the Cathar Empire's operational manuals. Commander Hazreth chose the 3rd option no one had offered. She ordered a preemptive strike. Vera logged the order, registered her formal objection number 6, and watched the Cathar fleet's arsenal fire in maximum convergence format towards the small human ship. It was the response of a species that had learned, over 4 centuries of imperial expansion, that a demonstration of force was the universal grammar of interstellar relations, that showing teeth before the other did the same was survival, not aggression, that the only language all species understood without need for translation was the light spectrum of an operational arsenal. The projectiles traveled the distance towards the human ship. Vera counted the seconds to estimated impact with the same cold precision she had developed over years of service, not out of pleasure in what she was seeing, but because impact analysis would be the next data she needed. The impact did not come. The entire arsenal stopped. It did not slow down, was not deflected, did not explode prematurely. It simply stopped, 30 units from the human ship, as if the space between the two fleets had decided to become solid. For a moment that lasted 20 breaths, the Cathar fleet and the human ship remained in absolute silence, separated by a barrier that existed in no known physics manual. And then the human voice returned, with the same calm as the first transmission. Commander Hazreth had ordered all weapon systems to be reloaded and repositioned, and for 20 minutes, the crew of the Matriarch's Fist worked with the specific urgency of those who execute orders without questioning, not out of blind obedience, but because questioning would require accepting that the situation had completely escaped any operational model they possessed. Vera observed the process with the part of herself that always observed, the part that documented and analyzed and built explanatory models, and what that part saw was a crew that had crossed the border between the planned mission and the territory of complete improvisation and had not yet processed that transition. The human ship did not move during the 20 minutes of repositioning. It did not respond to the new weapon alignment. It did not alter its configuration. It remained where it was, 400 units away, with its identification systems active as a statement of intent. Vera, who had spent her life learning to read alien body language, could not classify what the human ship was doing into any known category of strategic behavior. It was not a defensive posture. It was not preparation for withdrawal. It was something that, if she had seen it in a biological being, she would have described as quiet waiting. When Hazreth ordered the second volley, Vera did not register an objection, not because she had agreed with the decision, but because she had reached the specific limit where the analyst in herself recognized that the data was sufficient and that any additional argument would be redundant. The result would be the same. The question was what to do with the result. The second arsenal stopped exactly as the first had, at the same distance, with the same absence of effect. But this time there was a difference. This time, the 6 escort ships of the Cathar fleet simultaneously shut down. It was not a combat shutdown. There was no shield failure, no system overload, no cascade of failures that occurs when a ship is hit by a weapon. It was a clean, sequential, and complete shutdown of every non-essential system, as if someone had inserted a maintenance shutdown command into each ship simultaneously. Reactors remained active enough to maintain life support. Internal communications continued to function, but propulsion, weaponry, navigation, external sensors, everything had simply stopped responding. The Matriarch's Fist had been left active. Only it. Vera spent the first 40 minutes after the event analyzing the diagnostic logs of the shutdown ships, using the internal communication channel that the humans had left intact. What she found was what she had expected and feared. There was no evidence of how the shutdown had occurred. There was no intrusion into systems, no code overwrite, no electromagnetic signal that had preceded the sequence. The ships had stopped functioning because something had decided they should stop, and the sophistication of the technology employed was sufficient to leave no detectable trace with the available instruments. It was at this point that the human transmission returned. Not immediately, as if they expected the message of the 6 ships' silence to be processed first. Commander Ul-Koran, your crew members on the escort ships are fine. Life support systems have autonomy for 120 hours. Your reactors are stable. No one was harmed. I would like to tell a story, if you permit. It is not a threat. It is an explanation. We believe we deserve to be understood before you make your next decision. Hazreth remained silent for a long time. Vera watched her and saw, for the first time since the mission had begun, something that was not in the commander's personality files. Genuine doubt. Not the performative doubt of someone deliberating to appear thoughtful, but the real doubt of someone who had reached the edge of her map and was looking into the blank space beyond it. Hazreth said that the humans could speak. The story the humans told was not transmitted in text or audio signal. It was transmitted in data and the data were primary historical records, not summaries, not interpretations, but raw files of events that had occurred 340 years ago in the human solar system. Vera took hours to process the full volume, but the most important layers were comprehensible in minutes, 3 centuries and 40 years ago, when humans had made their first successful interstellar journey and established the first colonies outside their home system. A species called the Dar-Ok had arrived before they could build any significant defenses. The Dar-Ok were an expansionist civilization of the type the galaxy had seen many times, motivated by resource scarcity and the logic that undefended territories were available territories. The human colonies had been incorporated into Dar-Ok space without negotiation, without formal warning, with an efficiency the Dar-Ok had probably considered pragmatism, and which humans had experienced as something for which the words of the period were inadequate. Personal log. Proxima 3 colony. Day 847 of occupation. My daughter asked today why we can't use our family language when the guards are present. I tried to explain. The words don't come. She is 4 years old. 4 years old. And already knows there are sounds that make her invisible to those who have decided we exist to serve them. If we survive this, no living being will ever feel what my daughter felt today. I will make this the only promise I have left to fulfill. The occupation had lasted 72 years. During that period, humans did what humans do when subjected to extreme and sustained pressure. They adapted. Not passively, not resignedly, but with the specific tenacity of a species that had evolved on a planet that had tried to kill it repeatedly and had survived by learning to transform adversity into instruction. They studied the Dar-Ok with the obsessive attention that only the need for survival produces. They learned their systems, their technology, their points of failure, and they built, in silence and over decades, a response that was, by its nature, invisible until the moment it no longer needed to be. The liberation had occurred in 6 days, without battle in the conventional sense. The Dar-Ok had woken up one day with all their control systems over human worlds simply not working, and with a message in their own languages, on the private frequencies of their highest commanders, that said, with the precision of someone who had spent 72 years learning exactly how to say certain things in ways that would be perfectly understood, that they could leave, that they would not be pursued, that this was a mercy, not a weakness, and that the price of a second visit would be entirely different from the price of a withdrawal. The Dar-Ok had left. They never returned. And humans, carrying the memory of 72 years of occupation and the awareness of what they had needed to become to survive it, had made a collective decision about the kind of power they would build and how they would use it. Not a power of conquest, because they had seen from within what conquest does to both the conquered and the conqueror. A power of a border, a power that said no at the cost of not needing to say it more than once. Silent space was not a claimed territory. It was a safety margin, a distance that ensured no human child would ever need to learn which sounds made her invisible to those who had decided her existence was instrumental. The transmission ended. On the command bridge of the Matriarch's Fist, no Kethar said anything for a long time. Vera looked at Commander Hazreth and saw something she had not seen before in 15 cycles of service together. She saw someone who had understood. Hazreth's decision to return was not dramatic. It was not the kind of moment that Kethar epic texts described as enlightenment. That specific instant when a being comprehends something fundamental about the nature of the universe and is transformed by that understanding. It was, instead, the kind of decision that intelligence analysts recognize more easily. The decision of someone who calculated that all available alternatives lead to the same outcome, and that the only variable that can still be controlled is how the outcome is accepted. Hazreth ordered internal communication silence for 30 minutes. It was a protocol reserved for staff deliberation, and Vera had participated in 3 such deliberations in her career, all in situations of genuine crisis, all involving decisions that would alter the course of entire missions. This one was different from the previous ones because, for the first time she could recall, there was a sense that the commander was not just recalculating strategy, she was recalculating something more fundamental than strategy. The 28 members of the staff gathered in the deliberation chamber, a circular room at the center of the flagship, designed specifically to eliminate visual hierarchy during the collective decision-making process. Every seat was identical, every position equidistant from the center. It was one of the few occasions when Cathar culture, which in almost all other contexts was rigidly hierarchical, formally recognized that the quality of a decision did not depend on the position of the one making it. Vera spoke forth after the 3 senior operations officers who presented their tactical assessments. What she said was not the cold, analytical version she had mentally prepared during the journey back to the ship graveyard. It was something closer to the truth she had been avoiding articulating since the beginning of the mission. There was a fundamental difference, she said, between being the most powerful species in an encounter and being the species with the most power in that encounter. The Cathar Empire had conquered 16 systems because in all those systems it had been simultaneously the most powerful species in the encounter and the species with the most power. Humans had changed that equation in a way no operational manual had foreseen. They had more power, much more. And the way they used that power, with surgical precision and consistent mercy, was not a demonstration of limitation. It was a declaration of values. A species that could destroy any fleet that entered its space and repeatedly chose not to destroy was sending a message that the Cathar Empire had systematically misinterpreted as weakness. But weakness does not leave 6 ships intact. Weakness does not paralyze entire fleets without casualties. Weakness does not know the chief engineer's name and the status of his medical records before first contact. What humans were demonstrating was the inverse of weakness. It was the kind of strength that only emerges from a species that had faced its own capacity for destruction and had made, collectively, the most difficult decision any species can make. The decision not to use everything it could use. The deliberation lasted 22 minutes. The result was a 25-3 vote in favor of returning to the border. The 3 dissenting votes were from the youngest officers, those who were still at the career stage where pride and strategy were indistinguishable. Vera had expected the inverse proportion and was, with the part of herself that still surprised at living beings, discreetly surprised and grateful. Hazreth announced the decision to the crew without excessive ceremony, which was also new. She communicated the return as an operational choice, based on information assessment, which was technically correct and diplomatically intelligent, and informed that full mission reports would be presented to the matriarchy with recommendations for reclassifying the status of humans in the Empire's strategic intelligence tables. The human ship, when Hazreth transmitted the decision, responded in 15 seconds. "Thank you, Commander. The escort ships will be reactivated in the next 5 minutes. We recommend a return route via the northern corridor, which avoids gravitational instability zones that your sensors probably did not detect upon entry. We would like to propose, when your authorities are willing, a formal communication channel. We believe the Cathar Empire and the Human Alliance have more in common than any of our files indicate. And we are, as I said before, genuinely curious about you." The escort ships came back to life sequentially, exactly as promised, with a timing precision that allowed no margin for error. The crew of each reported nominal systems, no damage, no unauthorized access detected, absolutely no evidence of how the shutdown had occurred or how it had been reversed. It was as if the ships had simply slept and awakened. The Cathar fleet began its return following the route the humans had recommended. Vera monitored the navigation sensors as they pulled away and verified in real time that the alternative route surgically avoided 3 gravitational instability zones that were indeed not marked on the fleet's maps, but which existed, verifiable by direct triangulation from the flagship's field sensors. Humans had mapped the risks of their own space in enough detail to protect an invading fleet on its way home. The message in Commander Hasreth's private quarters was discovered on the second night of the return journey when she went, for the first time since the mission began, to sleep for more than 3 consecutive hours. It had been carved into the wall next to her rest net, not in text, not in holographic light, but physically incised into the wall's lining material, as if a precision instrument had sculpted each symbol individually. It was written in sacred Kethar, not the formal Kethar that was taught in academies and used in state documents. The sacred Kethar, the language the matriarchy elders used exclusively in covenant renewal rituals, a writing system of 47,000 glyphs that took cycles of study to master and which no alien species had been documented as capable of reproducing with enough accuracy to be legible. The message read, "We know what you carry. We know what it costs to get here. We know the weight of the empire you build upon the memory of what you had to be to survive. We also carry that weight. The difference between us is not what we suffered. It is what we decided to do with what we suffered. You could erase our existence from this galaxy in the time it takes to read this. We chose not to erase yours, not out of limitation, out of memory of what it is to be erased. When you are ready to build something different from what you have built so far, we will be here, not as adversaries, as witnesses, that it is possible." Hasreth stood before the message for a long time. When Vera arrived at the quarters after the commander's call, she found her standing, motionless, looking at the glyphs with an expression that the analyst needed several moments to identify because it was not an expression she had seen many times on the face of any Kethar officer. It was reverence. Hasreth said nothing for a while. Then she said, in a low voice, that she had made the oldest mistake in the military history of any species. She had confused the choice not to act with the inability to act, and that the difference between the two was exactly the difference between a civilization that endured and one that did not. Vera looked at the message on the wall and thought of the fleets in the star graveyard, of every species that had entered silent space with the same calculation the Kethar fleet had brought, and had discovered, in the most irrevocable way possible, that the calculation was wrong. She thought of the Vrethkai crew member who had written in her final log that they were being held in hands, and how accurate that metaphor had been, because a hand that holds is not a hand that destroys, and the distinction is all the difference between 2 completely distinct types of power. Then she began to document everything, because that was what intelligence analysts did, and because this time, the report she would write would not be filed under the designation Fog Class. This time, someone would truly need to understand what had happened here and why it had mattered. The Kethar Supreme Matriarchy's audience chamber was the most imposing space Vera Osketh had ever stepped into in her entire career, and she had visited governance chambers in 8 different star systems. Built in the center of Korhas Prime, the imperial capital, the chamber was shaped like an inverted amphitheater, with the speaking position at the lowest point and the galleries rising in concentric curves to a height of 40 meters, each level reserved for a different layer of the imperial hierarchy. The acoustics were designed so that every word spoken at the center reached every point in the room with perfect clarity, without artificial amplification, which made the silence that formed when someone stopped speaking as present as the speech itself. Vera stood beside Commander Hasreth in the center of the chamber. It was the 22nd questioning session the matriarchy had convened since the fleet's return, and the first 21 had followed the predictable pattern of any institution confronted with information that contradicts its fundamental operating models. rejection, questioning of sources, request for additional data, questioning of additional data, and then a silence that meant the information had been processed but the response had not yet been formulated. This session was different. Vera knew because Supreme Matriarch Ikar-ul-Veth was personally present, which had not occurred in any of the previous sessions. Ikar was the highest authority of the Kethar Empire, a matriarch of 142 cycles who had survived 4 overthrow attempts and had expanded imperial territory into 3 systems during her regency. She was also, according to the files Vera had studied with the same care she dedicated to any subject of strategic analysis, the only Kethar leader of the last 2 centuries who had publicly distinguished between necessary expansion and expansion by habit. The Supreme Matriarch spoke before Hazrith could begin her prepared speech. She said she had read all the reports and all the logs and all the secondary data. She had consulted 3 independent analysts, 2 expansion historians, and a theologian who had spent 60 cycles studying the phenomenology of sacred power in galactic cultures, and what she had concluded, before hearing any additional words from the commander or the analyst, was that there were 2 ways to interpret what had happened in silent space, and that the chosen interpretation would determine the kind of empire the Kethar would be for the next 2 centuries. The first interpretation was defeat, that they had entered the territory of a species that had militarily outmatched them and returned with their weapon systems disabled and 6 ships temporarily deactivated, which constituted, in the vocabulary of imperial doctrine, a strategic humiliation requiring a proportional response. The second interpretation was an invitation, that they had entered the territory of a species that possessed enough power to destroy them and had, deliberately and documented, chosen not to do so, that had deactivated their ships without damaging them, guided their return along safer routes than they knew, and carved a message in their most sacred language that was, unambiguously, an offer of another way to exist in relation to each other. The Supreme Matriarch said she wanted to hear first-class analyst Vera Osketh's assessment of which of the 2 interpretations was more useful to the Empire in the long term, and that she was not asking out of protocol, but because she needed an honest answer from someone who had been there. Vera had prepared arguments. She had spent the weeks since the return building the most complete analytical case she had produced in 22 cycles of her career, with historical data, statistical projections, comparative analysis of all known civilizations that had come into contact with humans and the results of each of those contacts. There was the argument of security, the economic argument, the geopolitical argument within the galactic coalition. There were examples of species that had modified their relationship with humanity after first hostile contact and that had prospered from it. But the Supreme Matriarch had asked for the honest answer, and the honest answer was none of those arguments. Vera said that there was a Vrethkai navigation officer who had written in her final log that the humans were holding them in their hands, and that she had spent weeks thinking about that sentence. That a hand that holds is not a hand that destroys. That the Kethar Empire had built all its expansion doctrine on the premise that the universe was a place where only those who showed their teeth first survived, and that humans had demonstrated, with every action since first contact, that another kind of survival existed, the kind that did not require destroying what it feared, the kind that had emerged from 72 years of occupation and had produced, instead of a species that destroyed to never be destroyed again, a species that protected so that no one else would need to feel what they had felt, and that if the Empire interpreted this as defeat, it would be because it had confused the absence of destruction with weakness, and that error had been exactly the error that had sent hundreds of fleets to the Star Graveyard. There was a pause when Vera finished speaking. The chamber was silent in the way that only occurs when something important has just happened, and everyone present knows it. But there are no words yet for what it was. The Supreme Matriarch said that was the honest answer she had asked for, and that it was also the answer she had expected after reading the reports. She said that the Kethar Empire had reached the point where the habit of expansion had begun to be more costly than the gains it produced, and that the existence of a species that had transformed trauma into a border instead of an arsenal was, regardless of all other arguments, intelligence data of invaluable worth to any civilization willing to learn from the example of others. The matriarchy would vote for the opening of a formal communication channel with the Human Alliance, and first-class analyst Vera Osketh would be designated as the first Kethar ambassador. Vera's investiture speech as ambassador occurred 3 cycles later in the same audience chamber, but this time with a guest no audience chamber had ever received before. Commander Yara Nakamura had arrived that morning aboard a human ship that had descended to the surface of Korhas Prime without requesting authorization and without any docking sequence, simply appearing in the state reception courtyard at the exact coordinates that the visit protocol had specified, with a punctuality that event organizers would later interpret, depending on one's perspective, either as impeccable courtesy or as a subtle demonstration that humans knew exactly where they should be and when, regardless of the navigation difficulties any other visitor would have faced. Yara Nakamura was a middle-aged woman with short dark hair and an expression Vera had learned to identify as the human face in a state of quiet attention, that specific quality of presence that humans seemed capable of sustaining indefinitely and which other species often confused with passivity until the moment it ceased to be passive. She spoke formal Kethar with an accent but without errors, which meant she had studied the language seriously enough to overcome the accent, but had chosen to keep it, a choice Vera intuited as deliberate, a sign that the effort had been real and that performative perfection was not the goal. When Vera asked after the formal ceremony, during the first of many meetings that would follow, how humans had learned the sacred Kethar language, Yara smiled with that specific quality Vera had already begun to associate with the species, a smile that said the answer existed, but that the full answer would require more time than the moment allowed. She only said that humans had a particular talent for learning the languages of people they truly wished to understand, and that there was a fundamental difference between learning someone's language to control them and learning someone's language to converse with them, and that humans had discovered, in the most painful way possible, what happened when the first approach prevailed, and that this had become the most persistent motivation they possessed for practicing the second. Epilogue. 16 years later. The Kethar embassy at Threshold Station, the human outpost on the edge of silent space, was the tallest building on the station and the only one built with materials from 2 worlds simultaneously, the blue-gray stone of Korhas Prime and the reflective steel from the furnaces of Mars. Vera had designed the combination herself, not for symbolism, but because she had discovered that the mixture of the 2 materials produced a structural stability that neither achieved alone. Silent space remained silent. The warning buoys still transmitted in 12,000 languages, but now included a 13th option, a direct contact channel with the embassy for any species that wanted to talk before deciding what to do with what they found inside. 16 civilizations had used the channel in the last cycle. None had needed to enter the star graveyard to learn what they needed to learn. The silence remained. But now it was the silence of something that had chosen to be gentle. And there was an enormous difference between that silence and the silence of something that had nothing to say. The first was a promise. The second was merely absence. And any intelligence analyst with the slightest experience knew how to distinguish the two if they were willing to stop listening for what they expected to find and start listening for what was actually there. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. New stories arrive every week: exploration, interstellar diplomacy, and the moments when humanity proves, again, why the universe has learned to respect us.